In 1758, the Spanish Empire launched what they believed would be a decisive strike. 4,000 soldiers, the largest military expedition ever assembled in northern New Spain, marched toward the Red River. Their target, a Comanche village they'd been tracking for weeks. The Spanish had conquered the Aztec Empire with fewer men. They'd subjugated millions across 2 continents. They had guns, cannons, steel armor, and 3 centuries of military dominance behind them. The Comanche had horses. When the Spanish arrived at the village site, they found it abandoned. Not recently, strategically. The Comanche had known they were coming for days, maybe weeks. They'd moved their families, their lodges, everything, leaving behind only tracks leading in 6 different directions. The Spanish commander, Diego Ortiz Parilla, he made the fatal mistake of splitting his forces to follow those tracks. What happened next wasn't a battle, it was a demonstration. Comanche warriors appeared on the horizon in groups of 50, then 100, then more than the Spanish could count. They didn't charge in a single mass like European cavalry. They came in waves from multiple directions, never where the Spanish expected. Their horses wheeled and turned with impossible precision. Warriors fired arrows from beneath their horses' necks at full gallop, reloaded while hanging off the side of their mounts, then vanished into the tall grass before Spanish muskets could even be aimed. For 3 days, the Comanche harassed, encircled, and systematically destroyed Parilla's expedition. They picked off soldiers who strayed from the main group. They stampeded the Spanish horses at night. They appeared, attacked, and disappeared so quickly that Spanish soldiers began firing at shadows. By the time Parilla retreated, and it was absolutely a retreat, he lost hundreds of men, most of his supplies, and any illusion that Spain could project power into Comanche territory. The Spanish Empire had faced indigenous resistance before, but this was different. This wasn't a desperate defense by a conquered people. This was a calculated military defeat administered by an empire at the height of its power, because that's what the Comanche had become, an empire. And for the next century and a half, they would do to 3 successive superpowers what no other indigenous nation in North America could accomplish. They would stop them cold. To understand how the Comanche became the dominant power across the southern plains, we need to understand what they were before the horse. In the early 1600s, the people who would become the Comanche were called the Numunu, the people. They were a small Shoshone band living in the Rocky Mountains of what's now Wyoming. They survived in one of the harshest environments on the continent. High altitude, brutal winters, scarce game. They were nobody's idea of a superpower. Then, sometime around 1680, everything changed. The Pueblo Revolt of 1680 was a coordinated uprising of Pueblo peoples against Spanish colonizers in what's now New Mexico. The Spanish were driven out, their settlements burned, their churches destroyed. But the Pueblo people did something else, or something that would reshape the entire continent. They released thousands of Spanish horses. These weren't just any horses. These were war horses, bred for centuries in Spain, descendants of Arab and Berber stock brought during the Islamic conquest of Iberia. They were faster, stronger, and more intelligent than anything that had existed in the Americas for 10,000 years. And they bred fast. Within 2 generations, horses had spread across the plains through trade networks, theft, and wild herds. Every indigenous nation on the plains acquired horses during this period. The Lakota got horses, the Cheyenne got horses, the Apache, Kiowa, Pawnee, everyone got horses. But the Comanche didn't just get horses, they became one with them. By 1700, Comanche children were learning to ride before they could walk. By age 5, they could hang off the side of a galloping horse and fire arrows under its neck. By adolescence, they could perform maneuvers that European cavalry officers considered physically impossible. A Comanche warrior could fire 20 arrows in the time it took a Spanish soldier to reload a musket, once shoot accurately at full gallop from any position on the horse, change horses mid-raid without dismounting, ride for 18 hours straight with minimal rest, communicate complex tactical information across miles using only horse movements. Spanish observers described watching Comanche riders pick up wounded comrades from the ground at full speed, swing them onto their horses, and disappear over the horizon before infantry could even form a firing line. French traders wrote that Comanche horsemanship made European cavalry look clumsy as children on ponies. But technical skill wasn't what made the Comanche unstoppable, it was what they did with that skill. The Comanche looked at the horse and saw what no European empire had seen. Not just transportation, not just a weapon, but the key to reimagining warfare itself. They abandoned agriculture. Why grow crops when you could control the buffalo herds? They abandoned permanent settlements. Why build villages when mobility was power? They restructured their entire society around a single principle: cavalry dominance. By 1720, the Comanche had moved south out of the Rockies and onto the southern plains, and they didn't come as migrants looking for empty land. They came as conquerors. The Apache controlled the southern plains in the early 1700s. They'd been there for generations, living in settled agricultural villages, supplementing farming still with buffalo hunting. They were numerous, well organized, and had their own horse culture. The Comanche destroyed them in less than 30 years. This wasn't a war of attrition, it was systematic displacement. The Comanche identified Apache settlements, waited until the men were away on hunts, then struck the villages. They took horses, captives, and supplies, then vanished before Apache warriors could respond. When the Apache tried to retaliate, they found Comanche bands impossible to pin down. Apache villages needed water, farmland, defensible positions. These requirements made them predictable. The Comanche needed nothing except grass for their horses and buffalo to hunt. They could be anywhere. By 1750, the Apache had been pushed entirely out of the plains, some south toward Spanish missions in Texas, others west into the deserts of New Mexico and Arizona. The Comanche now controlled an area larger than most European nations, from the Arkansas River in the north to the Texas Hill Country in the south, from the Rocky Mountains in the west to the Cross Timbers in the east. This region, over 240,000 square miles, became known as Comancheria, and it operated as an independent nation with its own foreign policy, its own economy, and its own imperial ambitions. Here's what most people miss. The Comanche weren't just defending territory, they were extracting resources from 3 neighboring empires simultaneously. Spain, France, and eventually Mexico all wanted what the Comanche had: the buffalo herds, the trade routes, the strategic position in the center of the continent. But none of them could take it by force, so they paid tribute instead. The Comanche developed a sophisticated system of economic control. They raided Spanish settlements in Texas and New Mexico, taking horses, mules, and captives. Then they traded those horses to French merchants in Louisiana for guns, ammunition, and metal tools. Then they traded buffalo robes and captives to both French and Spanish traders for more goods. Then they raided again. It was a circular economy built on military dominance. Spanish records from the 1750s and 60s are filled with desperate letters from colonial governors begging Mexico City for more soldiers, more guns, more money to defend against Comanche raids. The standard Spanish response was to offer peace treaties and trade agreements, essentially paying the Comanche to not raid certain areas. The Comanche took the payments and raided anyway. One Spanish governor described the situation perfectly in 1766. "We are not at war with the Comanche, we are their tributary vassals. A European empire, master of 2 continents, paying tribute to a horse nation they couldn't defeat militarily." If you're finding this deep dive into Comanche strategy fascinating, you're exactly the kind of viewer this channel is built for. Hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications. We're covering the rise and fall of empires most history classes never mention, and the Comanche story gets even more complex from here. Let's talk about Comanche political structure, because it's key to understanding how they maintained power for so long. The Comanche had no central government, no single chief, no capital city, no bureaucracy. This drove European diplomats insane. Spanish officials would negotiate a peace treaty with one Comanche band only to have a completely different band raid their settlements the next week. When the Spanish complained that the treaty had been violated, the Comanche would explain, truthfully, that the raiding band hadn't agreed to any treaty. They were autonomous. The Comanche were organized into 12 to 15 major bands, each ranging from 100 to several thousand people. Each band was led by a peace chief who handled diplomacy and internal disputes, and multiple war chiefs who led raids and military operations. These leaders had no coercive power. They led through reputation, skill, and the willingness of warriors to follow them. Warriors chose which raids to join based on the war chief's track record. If a chief led successful raids with minimal casualties, his reputation grew and more warriors followed him. If he made bad decisions and got people killed, warriors joined other chiefs' raids instead. This created a Darwinian selection process for military leadership. The best tactical minds rose to prominence. The incompetent lost followers and faded into irrelevance. It also created something European empires couldn't counter: strategic unpredictability. Spain couldn't decapitate Comanche leadership because there was no head to cut off. France couldn't negotiate a comprehensive peace because no single Comanche leader spoke for all Comanche. Mexico couldn't predict where attacks would come from because Comanche bands didn't coordinate through a central command. They coordinated through shared culture, family ties, and mutual economic interest. The political structure that looked like weakness to European eyes was actually the Comanche's greatest strategic asset. But decentralization only works if you have something else holding the system together. For the Comanche, that something was their economic model. The Comanche economy ran on three pillars: buffalo hunting, horse raiding, and captive trading. Buffalo provided everything: food, shelter, clothing, tools, trade goods. A successful Comanche hunter could kill enough buffalo in a few weeks to feed his family for months. The hides alone were worth fortunes in French and Spanish trading posts. Horses were currency, status, and military power combined. A wealthy Comanche man might own 50 to 100 horses. A poor man might have 5. Acquiring horses through breeding, trading, or raiding was the primary way young men built wealth and reputation. And then there were the captives. This is where the Comanche story gets complicated and dark. Comanche raids on Spanish and Mexican settlements weren't just military strikes. They were slaving expeditions. Women and children were taken as captives, and their fates varied. Some were adopted into Comanche families, especially young children who could be assimilated into the culture. Some were held for ransom. Some were traded to other tribes or to Spanish and French merchants. Adult male captives were usually killed. The Comanche had no use for them and considered them too dangerous to keep. Although Spanish records document thousands of captives taken over a century of Comanche raiding, Mexican records document thousands more. The human cost was immense, and the terror these raids created in frontier settlements was real and devastating. Here's the thing historians have to grapple with. The Comanche weren't unique in this practice. Spanish colonists enslaved indigenous people by the tens of thousands. The French participated in indigenous slave networks throughout North America. Mexico continued Spanish policies of forced labor and land theft. The difference was that the Comanche were winning. They'd taken the tools of empire, military slavery, resource extraction, tributary relationships, and turned them against the empires themselves. They'd created a mirror image of European colonialism, but one where indigenous people held the power. That didn't make it moral, but it made it effective. By 1800, the geopolitical situation on the southern plains had shifted dramatically. France had sold Louisiana to the United States. Spain still held Texas and New Mexico, but their empire was crumbling. Mexico would gain independence in 1821, inheriting Spain's problems with the Comanche, but none of Spain's resources to address them. And the Comanche were stronger than ever. They'd spent a century perfecting mobile warfare. They controlled the richest buffalo hunting grounds on the continent. They had trade relationships with American merchants, British arms dealers operating out of Canada, and remaining Spanish and French traders. They had tens of thousands of horses and a military culture that could mobilize thousands of warriors within days. Most importantly, they developed diplomatic sophistication. Comanche leaders understood balance of power politics. When Spain seemed too strong in one region, the Comanche would trade more with French Louisiana to acquire better weapons. When American settlers started pushing west, some Comanche bands allied with Mexico against a common threat. When Mexico tried to restrict Comanche raiding, the Comanche would sell horses and buffalo robes to American traders instead. They played empires against each other with the skill of Renaissance Italian city-states. But they were about to face something none of those European empires had: American expansion. The United States in the early 1800s was still a relatively weak power on the global stage, but it had something Spain, France, and Mexico never had: an endless supply of settlers willing to move into contested territory. Spanish colonialism was extractive. They wanted resources to flow back to Madrid. French colonialism was mercantile. They wanted trade networks. Mexican colonialism inherited Spanish models and struggled to maintain them. American colonialism was different. It was replacement. Americans didn't just want to control Comanche territory. They wanted to fill it with American farms, American towns, American people, and they kept coming. The first major clash between the Comanche and the United States came in Texas. When Texas declared independence from Mexico in 1836, the new Texas Republic immediately pushed into Comanche territory. They built settlements on land the Comanche had controlled for over a century. The Comanche response was predictable. They raided the settlements, killed the settlers, took captives, and stole everything of value. Texas responded with ranger companies, small mobile units designed to fight the Comanche on their own terms. These weren't traditional soldiers. They were frontiersmen who knew the terrain, could track Comanche raiding parties, and were willing to fight with the same brutality the Comanche used. For the first time, the Comanche faced opponents who could match their mobility. In 1840, a Comanche delegation came to San Antonio to negotiate a peace treaty and the return of captives. The Texans demanded all captives be returned. The Comanche brought one, a teenage girl who showed clear signs of abuse and mistreatment. The Texan accused the Comanche of negotiating in bad faith and tried to take the Comanche delegates hostage until all captives were returned. The result was the Council House fight, a close quarters battle inside the San Antonio courthouse. 35 Comanche were killed, including women and children. 7 Texans died. Comanche survivors were taken prisoner. When news reached Comancheria, the response was immediate and devastating. A war party of several hundred Comanche warriors swept through Texas settlements in what became known as the Great Raid of 1840. They burned Linville, a major port town, to the ground. They took captives and hundreds of horses. They killed dozens of settlers. Texas Rangers pursued them. At the Battle of Plum Creek, the Rangers caught up to the Comanche raiding party and inflicted serious casualties for the first time. The Comanche retreated, but they'd made their point: peace on Comanche terms or total war. For the next 15 years, Texas and Comancheria existed in a state of constant low-level warfare, punctuated by occasional treaties that neither side really honored. Then, in 1845, the United States annexed Texas, and the Comanche's problems multiplied. Here's where the Comanche story intersects with larger American history in ways most textbooks gloss over. The Mexican-American War of 1846 to 1848 was fought primarily over Texas and California. But the real prize was the land in between: New Mexico, Arizona, and Comancheria. The United States defeated Mexico decisively. Under the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo, Mexico ceded half its territory to the United States. On paper, this included Comancheria. On paper. In reality, the U.S. had just claimed territory it didn't control and couldn't defend. American officials drew lines on maps showing Comancheria as U.S. territory. Comanche leaders looked at those same maps and laughed. The U.S. Army tried establishing forts in Comanche territory. The Comanche ignored them. When soldiers ventured out on patrol, Comanche warriors would track them, steal their horses at night, and watch them walk back to their forts on foot. American settlers tried establishing farms and ranches. Comanche raiders burned them out. For a decade after annexing Comancheria on paper, the United States exercised virtually no control over the territory. The Comanche remained the de facto power. But the U.S. ultimately had something no previous empire had: the telegraph, the railroad, and industrial manufacturing capacity. By the 1850s, the United States was transitioning from an agricultural economy to an industrial one. They could produce guns, ammunition, and supplies at scales the Comanche couldn't match. They could communicate across vast distances instantly. They could move troops and supplies by rail instead of by horse. Most importantly, they had the Colt revolver. Before the Colt revolver, soldiers fighting Comanche warriors faced a terrible calculus. They could fire one shot from their musket, maybe two if they were very fast at reloading, before Comanche warriors closed the distance and killed them with arrows, lances, or hand-to-hand combat. The Colt revolver changed that equation. A soldier with a Colt could fire 6 shots before reloading. A cavalry trooper with 2 Colts could fire 12. Suddenly, American forces could match Comanche firepower in close quarters combat. But technology alone wouldn't defeat the Comanche. The U.S. needed a strategy. They found it in total war. The American Civil War interrupted U.S. military operations against the Comanche from 1861 to 1865. Federal forts were abandoned. Troops were pulled east to fight the Confederacy. For 4 years, the Comanche had free reign across Texas and New Mexico. They used that time to raid deeper into Texas than ever before, pushing almost to the Gulf Coast, taking hundreds of captives and thousands of horses. When the Civil War ended, the United States returned with a new approach. General William Tecumseh Sherman, fresh from his march to the sea through Georgia, given command of the Division of the Missouri, which included Comanche territory. Sherman had pioneered total war against the Confederacy. destroying not just armies, but the entire economic and social infrastructure that supported those armies. He applied the same logic to the Comanche. Sherman's strategy had three components. First, eliminate the buffalo herds that fed Comanche independence. Second, build railroads and forts to project permanent power into Comancheria. Third, pursue Comanche bands relentlessly, not just to defeat them in battle, but to exhaust them, destroying their camps, their supplies, their horses, making the cost of resistance unbearable. The buffalo extermination was systematic and brutal. Professional hunters, encouraged by railroad companies and the U.S. government, slaughtered buffalo by the millions. They took the hides and left the meat to rot. In less than a decade, the southern buffalo herd, estimated at over 30 million animals in 1860, was reduced to less than 1,000. The ecological devastation was total. The economic base of Comanche power was destroyed. Comanche bands that had ranged freely for a century were suddenly struggling to find food. The herds they'd followed for generations were gone. Starvation became a real threat. Meanwhile, U.S. Army columns under commanders like Ranald Mackenzie pushed deeper into Comancheria than ever before. They didn't just fight Comanche warriors, they attacked Comanche camps, burned their lodges, slaughtered their horse herds, and destroyed their winter supplies. In September 1874, Mackenzie's 4th Cavalry found a massive Comanche encampment in Palo Duro Canyon, a hidden stronghold the Comanche had used for generations. The canyon was a natural fortress, steep walls, hidden entrances, water and grass for thousands of horses. Mackenzie attacked at dawn. His troops descended into the canyon and routed the Comanche, burning over 400 lodges and capturing 1,400 horses. Then Mackenzie did something the Comanche didn't anticipate. He ordered all 1,400 horses killed. This wasn't about winning a battle, it was about breaking Comanche power permanently. Without horses, the Comanche couldn't hunt buffalo effectively. They couldn't raid, they couldn't travel, they couldn't fight, they couldn't be Comanche. Quick thing, if you're this deep into the story and you're realizing just how complex this history actually is, you're exactly who this channel is for. Consider hitting the like button and dropping a comment about what surprised you most so far. The algorithm loves engagement, and it helps us reach more people who are hungry for history that doesn't pull punches. By 1875, most Comanche bands had been forced onto reservations, not because they'd been defeated in a single climactic battle, but because continuing to resist meant watching their children starve. The last major Comanche war chief to surrender was Quanah Parker. Quanah's story deserves its own video, but here's the short version. He was the son of a Comanche war chief and a white captive named Cynthia Ann Parker. He'd grown up in Comancheria, became one of the most skilled warriors of his generation, and led some of the last successful raids against American settlements. When Quanah finally came into Fort Sill in June 1875, he brought with him the last free Comanche band. He surrendered not to a military defeat, but to reality. There were no more buffalo to hunt, no more safe havens, no more viable path to Comanche independence. But surrender didn't mean submission. Quanah spent the next 30 years as the primary leader of the Comanche on the reservation, and he did something remarkable. He adapted. He learned English. He negotiated grazing leases that brought income to the Comanche. He used the American legal system to protect Comanche land rights. He met with presidents and generals and businessmen, advocating for his people within the constraints of the reservation system. He never stopped being Comanche. He just changed what being Comanche meant in a world where cavalry dominance was no longer possible. The reservation era was catastrophic for the Comanche in many ways. Disease, poverty, cultural suppression, the forced assimilation of children through boarding schools. The population, which had peaked at around 20,000 in the 1780s, dropped to fewer than 1,500 by 1900. But the Comanche survived. So why did the Comanche succeed for so long where other indigenous nations failed? Let's break down the key factors. First, they embraced technological change completely. When the horse arrived, they didn't just adopt it, they restructured their entire society around maximizing its potential. They became the best light cavalry in the world, not by accident, but through deliberate cultural evolution. Second, they understood strategic flexibility. Their decentralized political system made them impossible to defeat through conventional means. There was no capital to capture, no king to kill, no central army to destroy. Every band was autonomous but aligned by shared interests. Third, They controlled territory that was extremely difficult for empires to project power into. The southern plains had limited water sources, extreme temperatures, and few roads. The Comanche knew every waterhole, every canyon, every escape route. Invading armies didn't. Fourth, they exploited rivalries between empires. They traded with whoever offered the best terms, allied with whoever opposed their current enemies, and switched sides when circumstances changed. They were pragmatists, not ideologues. Fifth, and perhaps most importantly, they were willing to be ruthless. Comanche raids weren't symbolic gestures. They were calculated to inflict maximum economic damage and create terror that would discourage settlement. They understood that maintaining dominance required making resistance too costly to sustain. These same factors explain why they eventually lost. They embraced the horse completely, which meant when the buffalo were exterminated, they had no fallback economy. Their strategic flexibility worked against imperial armies but couldn't stop the slow encroachment of thousands of individual settlers. Their territorial control was perfect for defense but provided no industrial base for modern weapons production. Their pragmatic alliances couldn't compensate for being outnumbered 100 to 1. And their ruthlessness, which had worked against Spanish soldiers and Mexican garrisons, created a level of hatred among American settlers that made negotiated peace nearly impossible. The Comanche didn't lose because they made mistakes. They lost because they faced something unprecedented. An industrializing empire with unlimited population reserves, telegraphic communication, railroad logistics, and the political will to commit ecological genocide to win. Spain had tried to defeat the Comanche through military superiority. Failed. France had tried to control them through trade monopolies. Failed. Mexico had tried to contain them through treaties and frontier defenses. Failed. The United States succeeded not by defeating the Comanche in battle, though they did that eventually, but by destroying the ecological and economic foundations of Comanche society itself. It wasn't a cleaner victory. It wasn't a more honorable victory. But it was a total victory in a way the previous empires had never managed. Here's what the Comanche story tells us about empire more broadly. Empires don't fall to superior virtue. They fall to superior logistics. Spain had better armor, better fortifications, and more soldiers. But they couldn't keep those soldiers supplied 300 miles from the nearest Spanish settlement, while being harassed by the best light cavalry on the continent. France had better trade goods and diplomatic finesse, but they couldn't convince the Comanche to stop raiding when raiding was more profitable than trading. Mexico had legal claims and international recognition, but they couldn't translate paper sovereignty into actual control. The United States succeeded because they could build railroads that brought in endless supplies, and telegraph lines that coordinated troop movements, and industrial slaughterhouses that killed buffalo faster than they could reproduce. Comanche military genius, and it was genius, couldn't overcome those structural advantages forever. But for 150 years, it did. For 6 generations, the Comanche maintained independence against 3 successive empires. They built wealth, they controlled territory, they dictated terms to colonial governors who ruled over millions. They proved that indigenous people weren't inevitably doomed by European contact. Given the right combination of geography, technology, political organization, and military culture, indigenous empires could compete with European ones. The Comanche eventually lost not because they were primitive or backwards or incapable of adaptation. They lost because industrial capitalism generated resources at scales no horse-based economy could match. That's not a moral judgment. It's a historical fact. Today, the Comanche Nation has about 17,000 enrolled members. They're based in Lawton, Oklahoma, on a small fraction of what was once Comancheria. They've survived forced assimilation, boarding schools, poverty, and every attempt to erase their identity. They're still here. And that matters because the Comanche story isn't just about the past. It's about how we understand power, resistance, and adaptation. Most American history textbooks present westward expansion as inevitable, manifest destiny, the triumph of civilization over wilderness, the replacement of savagery with progress. The Comanche story demolishes that narrative. There was nothing inevitable about American control of the plains. It required decades of military campaigns, millions of dollars, ecological destruction on a continental scale, and tactics that would be considered war crimes by modern standards. The Comanche didn't lose because they were outmatched by a superior civilization. They lost because they were ground down by industrial warfare. There's a tendency in some circles to romanticize indigenous resistance, to portray it as noble but futile, a doomed struggle against the march of history. The Comanche story rejects that too. For 150 years, the Comanche won. They expanded their territory. They built wealth. They forced 3 empires to treat them as equals. They adapted continuously, learning Spanish to negotiate better treaties, learning French to access better trade networks, learning the rhythms of American settlement to raid more effectively. They were a legitimate empire by any meaningful definition. They controlled territory through military force. They extracted tribute from weaker neighbors. They engaged in diplomacy as equals with major powers. The fact that they did all this without cities or writing or centralized government or industrial technology makes it more impressive, not less. Let me leave you with one final thought. In 1865, at the end of the Civil War, the United States had just finished a conflict that killed over 600,000 Americans. They had battle-tested generals, industrial manufacturing capacity, a transcontinental telegraph network, and a population of over 30 million. The Comanche had maybe 8,000 people, no central government, and an economy based on hunting animals that were already being systematically exterminated. It took the United States another 10 years of continuous military operations to finally force the Comanche onto reservations. 10 years. Against an enemy that couldn't manufacture gunpowder, couldn't build railroads, couldn't read telegraphic dispatches, and couldn't field armies larger than a few thousand warriors. That's not a testament to American weakness. It's a testament to just how formidable the Comanche were. They built an empire that lasted longer than many European dynasties. They developed military tactics that modern cavalry still study. They maintained independence longer than any other indigenous nation on the plains. And they did it all on horseback. 3 empires tried to break them. 3 empires failed. The 4th succeeded, but only barely, and only by changing the rules of the game entirely. That's the Comanche story. Not victims, not savages, not a footnote. An empire. The horse lords of the plains who held the center of a continent for a century and a half and who made the most powerful nations on earth bleed for every mile they tried to take. Remember that, because the history books won't tell you, but now you know.